Think about it. Think about it. Think about it.
Hi there. Thanks for tuning into Town Meeting TV's Under the Dome. This is our coverage of Vermont's legislature. We are wrapped up from the legislative session at this point, but we do still have a veto session up and coming in a couple weeks. It's the end of May today. We are talking about public safety and criminal justice today, and we are joined to talk about that by Tanya Wiechowski, Senator Tanya Wiechowski. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to be here again.
Awesome. Great. So, Senator Wiechowski, maybe if you could just, first of all, just start off with your district, who you represent, and how long you've been in the legislature, and what brings you to the legislature.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I represent the Chittenden Central District, which is comprised of most of Burlington, all of Winooski, a sliver of Colchester, and most of Essex. I'm finishing up my first term in the Senate, but I also did 2 years or one term in the House before that, where I represented what is now Chittenden 23, I think. At the time it was Chittenden 8-1, but it is Essex Town.
And so this is your first biennium in the Senate.
Yes.
Any reflections on the difference between those two bodies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely really, really different. And I think a lot of that is due to size. You know, there's 150 House reps, so it's kind of easy to get lost in that mix. Whereas there's only 30 senators. So there's just, you know, in the House, I think my whole 2 years there, and admittedly my 2 years there were during COVID, so I think are probably a little different than maybe the typical experience. You know, my full first year was all on Zoom, so I'm sure that added some to that sense of being a little bit lost in the mix. But my whole 2 years there, I think I maybe presented 2 bills on the floor, whereas, I mean, in the first month of, I did that in the Senate because there are just fewer of us, and the committees are smaller. So I found it a lot more relational. I was able to build deeper relationships and understand people more and their motivations. And as a social worker, it felt like a really good fit for me and the skill set that I have.
Yeah, I want to hold on that because I think something that we think about a lot here that is challenging in a lot of ways right now is building relationships across difference.
Yes.
I can imagine that you have a very different set of values and a very different set of priorities from a lot of your colleagues in the Senate. How do you approach communicating across difference in the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it really does come down to relationship. I mean, certainly, being on the Judiciary Committee in a year like this year, there were a lot of different thoughts in the room about how to move forward. And at times, the chair of the committee and I had very different viewpoints about how to go forward, but I knew who he was and I knew what his values were. And what I did know is that what we wanted was the same outcome. We had different ideas on how to get there. And I actually think, my relationship, and I think I have a really good relationship with Senator Sears, is a really perfect example of how you do that. In so many ways, he and I don't share a lot of life experience, as a young woman and an older man and someone from Bennington versus Burlington, and just there's a bunch of different places, but we got to know each other as people first. And so really across the board, I think that is really important. And when I think about any instance, whether it's in the Senate or with my friends or with constituents, having a connection as human beings first, I think, is a really solid foundation for moving forward and navigating through difference, because you then have this sort of understanding, like, we're both people. We both, in most instances, want the best for whomever we're talking about. We just might have different ideas on how to get there.
Right. So we're talking about public safety and criminal justice, lots of different ideas
Yes.
on how to achieve those two things. So maybe just start with an overview of how you were thinking about those topics, those challenges in this session.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so first and foremost, when I think about public safety, I really try to expand the view of what that even is. A lot of times when we say public safety as a society, what we mean is policing and criminal legal responses. When I talk about public safety, what I'm really talking about is community safety. I'm talking about building spaces where everyone is safe and everyone has their basic needs met. And so I think that frame really brings how I tackle all of these issues and any of these issues. To me, affordable housing is public safety. To me, universal health care is public safety. And so it's not just about policing to me. And I think that throughout the session, that was pretty clear in a lot of my stances and a lot of the things I was bringing forward. And I think when we look at the statistics, both in this country and around the world, what works is that broader, more holistic view of community safety. What historically doesn't work is being tougher on crime or tougher on drugs. That hasn't been shown to be terribly effective at creating wholesale community safety.
So maybe we'll start in terms of the bill by bill. There were a few different bills that the Judiciary Committees looked at this year. One that actually started in the House and then came over and was partly included in the ultimate budget that was passed was a bill to expand the judiciary. And this is a topic that we've seen some coverage actually very recently in some of the big news outlets in Vermont about just the strain that our judiciary system, our judicial system is under right now. So can you talk a little bit about this? So this was a bill that was started in the House H 880 and then was ultimately folded into the budget to just try and expand some capacity for the judicial system. Can you talk about that bill?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an important bill. What we do know is that we have incredible court backlogs that are meaning that sometimes people are perhaps charged with a crime and they're not seeing a day in court for 3, 4, 5 years. And we know that that is incredibly bad for everyone involved. It's bad for the person who has been charged with the crime, it's bad for the communities, it's bad for the judiciary, and it's bad for public safety. All of the sociologic research shows that one of the biggest deterrents for engaging in criminal behavior is that you'll get caught and that you will face judgment quickly. And that's just not happening. We heard during testimony that our state's attorneys are carrying 400 and 500 case loads, and it's untenable. And so, for me, in a year when we are talking so much about public safety and we are talking so much about how long people are having to wait to see their day in court, again, it's not good for anyone. The expansion of the judiciary to navigate that and to tackle that and to really create a system where people, as they are constitutionally guaranteed, have a quick and speedy access to justice.
So how did we get here to have these thousands of cases, this huge backlog?
So a lot of times it's sort of chalked up to the pandemic, and the pandemic certainly didn't help, but there was a backlog before the pandemic. And, I think there have, over the course of decades, really been sort of a systematic underfunding and underinvestment in government. And this is a symptom of that. We've known for quite some time that we needed more judges or more state's attorneys to keep up with the inflow of what was coming in. Now, that's one way of navigating it. We can also tackle what is the inflow of what's coming in. We could think about, well, what do we make illegal? Because that's also going to, we can adjust the hose, so to say. But with everything that has been charged and is in our judiciary system, it's there. We have to deal with it. And it's not even just the criminal legal system that's being impacted. Probate court is slowed down. And so it's issues of trusts and wills, it's issues of divorces, it's issues of child custody, it's everything that is really being impacted. And that has a negative impact. When you're just told to just sit and pause and wait, hang out, good things don't happen there usually.
So what ultimately happened here in terms of what was included in the budget? How are we expanding the judiciary?
Yeah, so we did create some additional judicial positions. One of them will be a northern float position. So currently in the southern part of the state, there's a judge that floats through and sort of picks up in areas where there's an increase today, or that judge is out, and that doesn't exist in the northern region. And what that ultimately means is that every judge in the northern region has to sort of have a float day, a day where they're not handling their docket, they're off handling somebody else's docket. And so this creates that float position to be able to go and pick up the slack without pulling a judge from a courtroom. And it created the judicial assistants that they need to manage that, because anytime you have a judge, you need the support staff to go with the judge. And then the other position, and this bill went through so many different iterations, was a position that is meant to handle the treatment court docket much more exclusively. So again, what's happening right now is judges are pulled from a day of their courtroom to go handle the treatment court. And this creates a position that is exclusively to navigate through treatment court, which hopefully will ease the backlogs, but also help people who are entering the criminal legal system because they have a substance use disorder, which this is a place where I think we could adjust what's coming in and perhaps not treat those as crimes, but instead as public health issues. But the treatment court person can help those people to navigate through treatment court and hopefully access services sooner, which is, of course, good for public safety, but it's also better for the people who have substance use disorders in that they are less likely to die of an overdose if they're quickly moved into the supports and services that they need.
It seemed like there was some disagreement between the House and the Senate on how to pay for this expansion and the scale of the expansion. And this seemed like kind of a theme across a few different bills. There were some House bills that came across, this one about the judiciary, but also one about Medicaid, one about housing, that had attached to it some new revenues that ultimately didn't survive on the Senate side. Can you talk about just those dynamics? Was there not an appetite for some of those new taxes on the Senate side that were passed in the House, specifically related to this bill? I guess we can start
Yeah, I mean, there definitely were some new revenue streams that came from the House that certainly I was supportive of, but it didn't seem that there was enough appetite for that in the Senate to actually have that taken up. And I know one of the frustrations that was sort of expressed by some senators was the House's decision to fund a lot of these programs only in part. So they basically said, we're going to give you 100% of the funding, but for half the year. And I think there was concern as to well, then what? And I can certainly understand where that concern came from in terms of the, new revenue streams and really thinking about taxing for, I know one of the bills that came over that didn't make it was a wealth tax. That is certainly something I would support, and I hope that we come back and we really consider, again, asking the richest Vermonters to pay their fair share into a system of government that works for everyone. But there was not the appetite to do it in the larger Senate.
I'm curious about that because it does seem, I know we're getting we'll get back to criminal justice in a second, but I think there is this larger, we're coming out of the pandemic. The resources are fewer and farther between than they were a couple years ago when we had federal resources. And there's a lot of ambition to solve a lot of really difficult problems that the state is facing. And it seems like there's a need for, if we want to address them, for new revenue sources. And there's some disagreement about that. What is, when you talk to your Senate colleagues about the reluctance around a wealth tax or a really high, an income tax on income above $500,000, an increase there, or an increase on property transfer taxes for properties above $800,000, whatever it was. What do you hear from those colleagues?
Yeah, so it's challenging because I'm not on the Finance Committee, which is the tax committee where those conversations are a little bit more in depth. And so a lot of times those conversations have happened behind those doors by the time they make it. So there isn't as much organic space to explore. I think I'm hesitant to sort of speculate what the concern is, and I think I also come at it from a space of course that makes sense. Of course we have to do that, and I also know there is some real rub with the governor on any new taxes, regardless of who they're taxing, and so I think that it was a really challenging year to thread all of that, and so. Again, I know there are other senators that support wealth taxes. It just doesn't seem like at this point there is a critical mass to make that happen. And I hope that changes. I really do. I think we have to have a society where people pay in their fair share in order to make sure that everyone has what they need. That just feels to me obvious. I also know that Vermont is a small state, and the scope of some of these crises are not going to be solved without federal assistance.
Let's move on now to a bill concerning, well, there are a few things here. This was the Public Safety Omnibus Bill, S58, but one part of that bill was the sort of raise the age effort in Vermont. Can you talk about this bill a little bit?
Yeah. So this bill is a bill that I voted no for. I'm certainly happy to talk about it, but this is a bill that I absolutely could not support. I think most of this bill was taking us backwards, not forwards. It was undoing criminal legal reform work that we had done and was really utilizing ideas from the Nixon era war on drugs and crime that have proven to be incredibly harmful and not actually create any additional public safety. But the raise the age piece specifically, so years back now, I think it was actually before I was in the legislature, raise the age legislation was initiated. That was going to slowly over time raise the age at which young people who were over the age of majority could be treated as youthful offenders. It was really recognizing that 18 is kind of an arbitrary line that's been drawn in the sand, and it's actually not based on the brain science of how brains develop. What we now know with newer brain science is that the brain is really still developing until the mid-20s. The number often stated as 25 is when you can sort of almost guarantee that the brain will be fully developed. And the last part of your brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that does making snap decisions in emotional moments and, doing sort of like action consequence planning and what we often call hot cognition, and sort of like how we process information in the heat of the moment, which if you're thinking about crime, that's a really important part of the brain to have developed. So legislation was passed to create this window for these young people between 18 and I think it would cut off at under 22. So it's not quite caught up with the brain science. And the first year was phased in, so now people who are under the age of 19 but not yet 20 are treated in this youthful offender category. And right before the pandemic, the next year was supposed to roll in. The pandemic happened. People were like, whoa, there's everything, like, let's pause. And so it was paused, and then and that was paused again, and then it was paused again. And S58 is a further extension of that pause. And it put into some parameters, because what we keep hearing is, DCF comes and says we don't have the resources to do this, and the administration is like, this is bad for public safety. But the data just doesn't bear that out. Actually, there was because Vermont was one of the first places to do this, there was some research done, some national research done, and what it actually showed is that bringing in those 18-year-olds lowered the rates of youth engaging in criminal activity, and actually lowered the rates of that engagement with DCF. So while I'm hearing that they don't have the resources, what we actually saw is that it didn't create an increased need for resources, it created a decreased need for resources, because people were able to respond in a really different way that didn't sideline their whole lives early on while they were still developing that hot cognition.
Right. So what can you explain the difference between if they're tried in sort of an adult court versus in juvenile court?
Versus youthful offender. Yeah. Well, so there's 3 categories in Vermont because of the way it's done. There is juvenile court if you're under 18. Mm-hmm. There's youthful offender, which is if you're in this age range and you're, for most reasons, treated very similar to the juvenile court system, and then there's the adult criminal court system. And the juvenile court system and the youthful offender system allow a much broader access to resources. So for example, youthful offender, if they go into this youthful offender category, they get a DCF case manager, and if they complete all of their stuff, they don't have a criminal record. And it creates more privacy around what's going on for them, as opposed to the criminal court system where, like, you get a lawyer, hopefully, you can afford one, or there's a public defender available to you, although that's not always the case. And you go through a criminal legal process, and on the other end of that, you're either found guilty or not guilty. The youthful offender and the juvenile process really create more systems of saying, like, what failed here? What systems failed? What do you need to learn? What do you need to know? And again, it goes through children and families. It doesn't go through, and DCF has a judicial arm to it, so there are these juvenile justice proceedings have records and there's accountability, but it's not the same punitive criminal legal mechanism. It's much more of a mechanism of like, all right, a mistake was made. What do we need to do? Mm-hmm.
Let's move on now to H72, which is the bill that would establish an overdose prevention center pilot program in Burlington. So can you tell us a little bit about that bill and what it will do?
Yeah, H72 uses opioid settlement funds, so it's not taxpayer dollars. These are monies that were recovered from lawsuits against the opioid manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies that profited off of their overuse. It will create a pilot center, so it provides the funds for 3 years of piloting in Burlington an overdose prevention center. And an overdose prevention center is a place that one can go that is staffed by medical staff and professionals to use the substances that they have. And if an overdose occurs, they can reverse it right there on the spot. There are over 200 overdose prevention centers around the world. The earliest opened in the mid-1980s in Switzerland. There has never been a fatal overdose at an overdose prevention center. All of the research shows that they do not increase crime, they actually decrease crime. And the most important thing is that they keep people alive. And they keep people, most overdose prevention centers, when they're done really well, also have a suite of other services. So if you're utilizing the overdose prevention center, you might also be seeing a counselor, you might also be getting job training, you might also be having wound care, or whatever it is that you need. And the currently only operating overdose prevention center is in New York. They have 2 sites in Jackson Heights and, I'm going to forget the other spot that they have one, but there's 2 sites in New York. They've been operating for a little over 2 years. And over 75% of the people utilizing the Overdose Prevention Center are also using some other service there. So it's a really great way of building trust and connecting people to services while keeping them alive. And so we're using the overdose opioid settlement funds to pilot one of these in Burlington, where we know that overdose rates are completely out of control. It's a crisis. I mean, people are dying almost every day. And right now, I think it was State's Attorney Sarah George who pointed out very rightfully so, that there are unsafe consumption sites all over the city. This allows us to create safety both for our communities and for the people who are using substances.
I think the concern sometimes that people have about this idea is that it invites more drug use and drug sales, illegal drug sales. But do you think that's true?
I mean, I certainly think it is true that is a concern that people have, but the data across the world simply doesn't bear it out.
Can you say more about that? You said that actually these centers decrease crime rather than increasing crime.
They do. So there's, like I said, there's studies all over the world, but the study I'm most familiar with is a Brown University study that was done in the site in New York over the last 2 years. And I can certainly get that to you if that's helpful, but they actually did quite a bit of research, and what they found was that crime in that area went down, syringe litter went down, parks that had previously been closed because people were utilizing substances in those parks are now open and vibrant, filled with families again, because people don't have to hide in the shadows, people don't have to throw things on the ground, and the crimes that sometimes would happen between people are now moved into a space that can be mediated, or people feel safe. Both the people using substances and the people in the community. And again, they also tracked emergency responses to that neighborhood, and they didn't increase. In fact, they decreased. And so, I could speculate, as a social worker and as someone who has education in, how humans work, as to why we see that. But the studies don't often look into the whys, just the numbers. And the numbers, again, there's the Brown study, and then one of the things I sometimes hear is, well, that's only been there 2 years. At which point I usually will zoom out of this country and look at, the 200 sites all over the world. Canada's got 30 or 40 sites at this point. There's the site in Switzerland, there are sites in Russia and Ukraine, and they're all over the world, and they work.
With a few minutes left here, maybe we'll turn to this bill that was passed about retail theft penalties. And I think there's been a lot of conversation, testimony. At least we had a conversation with House reps last week about this bill, and they heard from a lot of their constituents, from business owners in their districts, that there's a lot of concern around retail theft increasing. And this bill is trying to address that. Can you speak to this bill and what you think it will do? I think it was passed.
I can speak to this bill. It wasn't, what we got from the House was a bill that proposed to aggregate the value of stolen property to allow it to become a felony if the amounts over a certain period of time in the same county added up to the felony threshold.
That is ultimately trying to create more felony charges for retail theft. Is that basically, was that?
That is what it did. I don't want to speak to the intention of the House members that introduced it. That's not what passed. The Senate instead created sort of first offense, second offense, third offense, and I think at the third offense it became a felony regardless of the amount. I voted no on both versions of this bill. I think this is a perfect example of not actually tackling the underlying issue, which is economic insecurity. If people have their basic needs met, they're probably not going to steal. And what we know is that a lot of these, we need to work to repair the harm done for the businesses, particularly our small businesses that are losing things, but we also need to create an economy where people don't need to steal to survive. And for me, saddling someone who stole 3 candy bars with a felony is the absolute wrong direction. The other thing that I think is really interesting is the sort of retail theft outcry is kind of false. The Retail Thefts Association actually very recently had to retract some statements that were proven to be false, that there has been a huge amount of drumming up of concern about this massive increase in retail theft and these rings of retail thieves, and they're not really there. And so for me, one of the things that was really tough this session is it felt like we were basing a lot of our policy not on data, but on vibes. And the data simply wasn't there to back a lot of it up. It's how I felt with S58. It's how I felt with the retail theft bill. And again, I'm not saying that retail theft isn't happening. And I'm not saying that there aren't some spaces where it may be increasing and that we don't have to do something for those people being harmed. But the sort of widespread rash of retail theft has actually proven to not be true. And the same with public safety. You know, people were relying in the public safety conversation a lot on data from mid-2022, but the 2023 data shows that with doing nothing, the crime rates were actually coming down again. And even in 2022, when the post-COVID crime rates were kind of at their peak, they were still significantly lower than they were in the 80s and 90s. So the overall trend line is down. There was a little peak around COVID. And in 2023, the Department of Justice data shows that it's actually trending back down, even though we changed nothing. So a lot of what this felt like to me was reactionary policy to the way people were feeling, as opposed to what was actually happening. And it's policy that I think is going to do a lot of harm.
Just a couple minutes left here. I think I want to ask a question just generally about I think there's been some conversation about the difference between actual safety and the feeling of safety or unsafety. How do you speak with constituents who are experiencing a lot of feelings of lack of safety in the community, and what advice do you have to them in terms of trying to resolve that feeling, or just how that plays into your decision making as a legislator?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I certainly take the way my constituents are feeling incredibly seriously. And I think first and foremost, and this is going to sound very social worky, but that is my profession, I want to listen to them. I want to validate that how they are feeling is real. They are feeling unsafe. That doesn't necessarily mean they are unsafe. And if I were sitting with someone in my office, that's exactly, and they told me I feel really unsafe. Okay, you feel really unsafe. That's real. That feeling is real and it is valid. Let's unpack that and understand why you're feeling unsafe and what we can do to give you more control over your feeling of safety. And it depends from person to person. For some people, it's enough to just share some of those statistics that they had no idea. They had no idea that actually the crime rates in 2022 are significantly lower than they were in 1990. And actually, in 2023, they're continuing to go down. And for some people, particularly people I already have a pretty good relationship with, that's enough for them to go do some research and be like, okay, like the way I'm feeling doesn't match the reality, which happens to all of us. That's just part of being human sometimes. We feel a certain way and we get really, really committed to feeling that way, and it's hard to be dissuaded from that. And the feeling is real. And then for other people, it takes more time. It takes more understanding. Sometimes it takes connecting them with resources. Sometimes it takes connecting them with support and mediation to navigate a conflict. But I'm always really committed to trying to do that, which is constituent services. It's community building. You know, I really think that one of the things that would go an incredibly long way to building public safety would be investing in more community building, more spaces where we can come together with people who had really different life experiences than us and have a supported dialogue. And so if I can create that, I try to. I try to help people to understand where someone else might be coming from while I'm understanding where they are coming from and bringing those vision points together. That is different than when I'm looking at legislation. When I'm looking at legislation, it is weighing like, will this help? Will this do harm? And is this within my core set of beliefs and morals and values? I absolutely want a community that is safe and vibrant. I do not believe some of the bills that we put forward this year as public safety bills will do that.
I think that's about all the time we have. We have like maybe 30 seconds left. If you want to add anything, or just sort of invite, where can your constituents find you if they wanted to chat with you about these things?
Yeah, absolutely. Constituents can always reach out to me at either my campaign email or my legislative email. That's usually the easiest way to get a hold of me. I also do have a phone, and there's on my website is my phone number. You can text me there. or reach out to me there. I can't remember it off the top of my head because I don't call myself that frequently. But email is usually the easiest way to get a hold of me. And I am always happy to chat through these issues and hear where people are coming from and help them to hear where I'm coming from, because I think that's where we make the best policies.
Great. Thank you so much, Senator Tanya Vyhovsky, for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thanks for tuning in to Under the Dome. We'll have just a couple more episodes here before we wrap up and end this year's legislative session and the biennium. So thanks for tuning in. So long.